From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South. The Kentucky Derby is upon us. Every year, tens of thousands gather to experience one of the most exciting pageants in sport. But like all things, there's a history and a culture to the Kentucky Derby, and to horse racing generally. The Derby reminds us not only of the importance of horse racing in American society, but in Southern culture too. The South, from its colonial beginnings, embraced the so-called sport of kings. Charleston, South Carolina was the unrivaled seat of horse racing in the 18th century, forming its jockey club as early as 1734. The popularity of the sport spread, and important tracks were established at Camden and Aiken, South Carolina, among others. To help us understand the history of horse racing in the South and explore its present-day cultural importance to an ever-evolving Southern identity, we are joined by one of the nation's experts on the topic, Professor Gabi Kuenzli of the History Department at the University of South Carolina. Gabi has written extensively on the subject and is well known for her pioneering work on Latino jockeys. She is author of Acting Inca, a truly fabulous book exploring the relationship between theater and identity in 20th century Bolivia, and her work on Latino jockeys has been published in Blood Horse, the premier publication on horse racing. Her work has been funded by the ACLS, and she is currently working on a book on Latino jockeys in the American South. Gabi, welcome to Take on the South.
Thank you so very much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you and Matt inviting me to talk today.
Well, it's our pleasure entirely. Before we get into the guts of your research, can you just tell us how your work on theatre and Bolivian identity in the 20th century connects to your current work on horse racing in the American South?
Okay. There are many answers to that question, but I'll give you sort of the academic answer. It has to, with booms and busts at universities and fundings and things like that. But the truth is that my work in Bolivia deals with local theatrical production where individuals who you would not think of as theaters year-round actually hold a very exclusive role in a pageant that takes place during the Virgen de Rosario fiesta in October in a small town called Caracollo. And what they do is represent the past of this town. And the the actors are rather important because there aren't that many, especially 20th century written records of the town that try to make sense of the historic past. And so it's a chance for people who may be running bars or stores or restaurants or have held political positions in the town, and that town is sort of a capital center for the area, to perform an Inca past for a zone that was historically associated with a different ethnic identity. And so I look at theater as a platform, how people make their own identities, and as festivals, as places not of inversion, of time of unleashing of anything goes for a finite period of time, but rather is related to the broader annual context in which all sorts of negotiations and assertions of identity take place.
All right. So from Bolivia to horse racing in the American South, the connection is performance, theater?
It's interesting. When I started with horse racing, I used to ride. I really liked riding when I was very young. Now I'm just sort of young. And my parents were like, well, that's okay, but it's enough. And I don't know when I started watching horse racing again, and I noticed as they flashed across the finish line, if you listen carefully, you could hear conversations in Spanish, jokes in Spanish, shout-outs to different regions of Latin America, and I'm like, oh my God, the top jockeys are all Latino. And so I began to look at this sort of pillar of U.S. and especially Southern identity, which is horse racing, right? It really defined, you know better than I, plantation society, competitions between plantation owners. It involved the slave population in significant ways and created spaces as much as it shut it down. And I began to say, look, this pillar of Southern identity is staffed in large part at all levels, not just at what's considered the lowest, and by lowest I do not mean less skilled, I mean worst paid. Not just at the lowest levels, by Latino professionals. And so I began to use sports as a lens and the track as a platform to look at how Southern identity is being remade. And that also led me to look at the deep, deep roots of racing in Latin America. If we're going to talk about the South and horse racing, you want to talk about being important to plantation society, you better talk about the history in Latin America, because it is as deep. And we have racetracks from the late 19th century, about the time that you find Churchill Downs, Tennessee, what was their racetrack in Memphis that it was called, two hot spots of racing. You'll find racetracks in Chile, in Venezuela, in Mexico, in Caliente, that date back to the late 19th century, and you can compare them to theaters or churches.
All right. That's persuaded me beyond belief.
You want to ride now?
The connection, that's right. Take me to, take me to Aiken next week. And I really like these intellectual connections and the kind of lived connection, right? I mean, you know, what we do as children matters, and it kind of filters through to what we become as adults. Before we get into that larger global South connection, can you talk and tell us a little bit about how horse racing, in all of its forms, outside of the 18th century, let's go into the 19th century, how it informed Southern identity, and how common was it? I mean, you know, we have, how many tracks in the 19th century? I mean, is it more Southern or Northern? Is it national?
Well, okay, so let's take the 1800s, okay, your 19th century. We've got tracks all over the place, all right? And what we also have, and here I want to recognize the work of the late and great Pelham McDaniels and his book on Isaac Burns Murphy, and Catherine Mooney and her work, Racehorse Men, who really looked at the way that both enslaved and free African Americans participated in racing. And the neat part is that, well, it's not the only neat part. I mean, it was a problematic spot. It was, if you were a really good jockey or horseman or trainer or groom, you could carve out a space for yourself within slavery. It was almost, and I don't want to use the term preferred spot, but in some ways it was, right? And your value was, the plantation owner's value was associated also with the value not only of his horses, but of his horsemen. So they would even lend out enslaved men to purchase horses for friends, right? Because they had such a good eye. They knew so much about horses. And they were able to amass more money, broker more deals. They also occupied the Oval in a prominent way throughout at least the first 20 years of the Kentucky Derby. The first Derby won by Oliver Lewis aboard the horse Aristides, trained by Williamson.
And when was that?
1875.
Okay, so it's after the Civil War.
Correct.
And building on developments before the Civil But
it's in the 1875. I mean, a lot of people, especially in South Carolina, worry so much about racetracks as associated with gambling and things like that. I got to tell you this, in the late 19th century, when you always had racing. People raced on plantations. They raced, out in the country, sure. But with the late 19th century, with things like Churchill Downs, you get the establishment of formal racetracks.
With rules and...
with grandstands, with carefully maintained tracks, right? So people who tend to associate horse racing with sort of lawlessness and gambling forget that the racetrack in itself was part of modernity. Okay, it was a formalization of a pillar of identity through the racetrack. In fact, I have one judge said in Tennessee, he said, "I know nothing of horses. I never made a bet in my life. I come to the Jockey Club because it's worthy of support, and it is an institution every citizen of Memphis should take pride in."
Ooh, like civic pride in horse racing.
Exactly. So it's a pride in the racetrack and in the institution. It's a way of establishing order. And part of that order had to do with having slaves ride your horses for big purses. But part of it, how much does an owner control? When you're out on the oval, you're calling a lot of the shots. Other people are seeing you. They're seeing your expertise. And so there are things that were beyond really the control of the plantation owner. Now, I'm not going to over-glorify the role of the slave jockey, because the overseers would often, if they thought they weren't making weight, would bury them in manure up to their neck.
Really?
They did terrible things to
Really?
them. So, look, it was tough. And sometimes the slave jockey caught between the slaves who didn't have the privileges of a jockey, who couldn't travel and go to racetracks and things like that, and the overseer sort of found themselves without God or the devil, as you say in Spanish, in a very lonely space, okay?
Sure.
So I don't want to over-glorify the role of the slave jockey here, but it has led to a significant, I'd say in recent times, reconsideration of racing to recognize the African-American past. Problematic in two ways. Absolutely well-deserved. However, there are many African-Americans still in horse racing. George Arnold, Kendrick Carmouche, Deshaun Parker. Why is it, the story sort of goes, black jockeys were really important until Jim Crow legislation, and then they fell off. And that was it. And that's true. Characters like, or jockeys, not characters, like Jimmy Wingfield had to go ride in Europe. I get that. But having said that, it didn't disappear. And I think that's a narrative that perhaps needs to be revisited with the prominent African Americans in racing.
Is it that it didn't disappear, it was on pause during Jim Crow and then it came back? Is that what happened? Or were there black jockeys during Jim Crow?
I think that's the question.
Huh.
I think that's a very good question.
Okay.
And that has not been explored. And the other place where I pick up is that, well, okay, Jim Crow legislation did limit the participation of African Americans in racing. Then who the hell was doing the riding, Mark?
Right.
And so there we pick up, that's where I pick up, with the rise of the Latino jockey. And I don't mean in the 1960s with Bill Leggett's infamous article, The Latin Invasion, in 1962 in Sports Illustrated. I can talk about that. But I'm talking about Latino jockeys. I mean, there was a famous horse. His name was Upset. He was the only horse to beat Man o' War. He had 3-4 jockeys who rode him all the time because horses raced a lot more.
Appropriate name, by the way.
Upset, yes.
Upset. I
yes.
mean, did
And
they
he got
name him
that
after,
No, they
after
named
the
him
victory?
before. I know. They're quick change the horse name. But Upset was a prominent horse. Now, he wasn't on Upset when he beat Man o' War. However, an individual named Joe Rodriguez was one of Upset's go-to jockeys. And what people forget, Mark, is that the racing circuit in the United States, up until, the 1940s, I mean, obviously Castro's Cuba was different, extended into Cuba, El Oriental racetrack, and extended into Mexico, Caliente in Tijuana. And so you get far lap running in Tijuana. These were huge, huge racetracks. And so there's a history of interaction, of hiring, making deals, buying horses together between people of Latin America and the United States.
So there's a more of an expansive South. I mean,
absolutely.
So racehorsing gives us a redefinition, or at least a
different
different geographic.
Correct.
Yeah, right.
It does not always have to be looked at via slavery. It can be looked at via horse racing. So it shouldn't surprise you that Joe Rodriguez was Cuban.
Right.
But it also shouldn't surprise you that there's not much litter on Rodriguez. That's one of the things I'm
not
looking
surprised.
at.
I mean, frankly, I don't think there's, apart from what you're doing, there isn't a whole lot of literature generally on this. So let me just you've given me a lot of information here, and I just want to sort of recalibrate it a bit. So, antebellum, you have enslaved jockeys. They're very important to this process.
Correct.
Post-Civil War, it becomes more professionalized, more systematized, which is very much in keeping with other sports, for example, American football,
Correct.
Boxing, So that's part of that moment of modernity for sports.
Correct.
And then we get into the 20th century, and you're telling me that the genealogy of Latino jockeys is much deeper than people assume, right? Partly because of the geography of horse racing. Is that right? Okay, so take us back to, can you give us a first, Gabi? A first. Like, if you had to say, this is the moment in the 20th century where Latino jockeys become known. Is it that Sports Illustrated bit, or is it precede that?
Okay. That's a good question. The first is not going to be my first. I'm going to speak to how people became more aware in a sort of printed, circulated way.
All right.
Look, you're right. No, not many people are working on this. They work on baseball. Mm-hmm. Huge shout out to Adrian Burgos and his work. Jose Alamillo, beautiful work on the Mexican diaspora in sports. But very few people are looking at horse racing. And when I work on horse racing, people say to me, they're like, there are two responses, right? They go, since when did you get interested in rich, white, old men? And the other thing and then they assume that it's totally uninteresting, that it's still for the totally elite, mm-hmm. and that it's totally boring. And then the other group says, oh, Latinos in horse racing, labor exploitation. Uh-huh. So we can look at Latinos in horse racing because the assumption is immediately they're at the bottom rungs. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then that we can compare it to meat packing or to chicken processing, right. And we look at a history of Latino labor exploitation. Mm-hmm. And what I'm arguing is no. What I'm arguing is that through sports and through horse racing specifically, given its long roots in the Americas, we have an example of Latino excellence. Okay, Latino excellence, mm-hmm. that is remaking the image of the Latino in the United States. They are remaking that image from the vantage point of the winner's circle. Mm-hmm. Now, this is an uphill project, and you asked me about a first. So we go back to Sports Illustrated, which was founded in 1954, and began, originally it struggled, and it's part of the Time Life mm-hmm. empire. Right. Time Life Fortune, so and then they go, in the 50s, they go, hey, what about sports? Nobody's picked it up, and they have a couple of really neat quotes about, if you want to see the soul of a man, you'll look at Sports Illustrated. Okay. So fine. They start Sports Illustrated. Sports Illustrated, I would also add, and this is worth probing, I've currently writing on Sports Illustrated, I've wrote a whole chapter on it, that it starts in an era of institutionalized racial integration. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, Sports Illustrated says, we don't want to touch that stuff because our readership is 99% white. Right. So it's a bizarro world where Sports Illustrated, with the exception of one series of articles, it's called The Black Athlete, A Shameful Story by Jack Owens, in 1967, and that was sort of snuck in, really doesn't want to touch it. 1962, I work with museums. I work out in Aiken. I work with the National Racing Museum in Saratoga often, and we did an exhibit last year on the immigrant experience. I have to remember the first part of the title. And they said to me, hey, Gabi, should we use the Leggett piece? Mm-hmm. And it's called The Latin Invasion.
And that's what he called it. Was that the title of it?
That is the title.
That's the title on Sports Illustrated?
Yes.
The Latin Invasion.
Correct.
Okay.
And so it is, in 1962, Bill Leggett in Sports Illustrated, which was the only big sports publication for mass appeal. There were trade magazines for racing, of course, but they reproduced some of the problems. And he basically, what I find with Sports Illustrated is it gives a platform for athletes of color and at the same time limits it. Mm-hmm. So it recognizes that there are many great writers, Braulio Baeza, Manny Casa, and many others, Angel Cordero, Lafitte Pincay. So they recognize all this, and then they offer descriptions of the individuals that are tremendously unflattering. They talk about how they're emotional, temperamental, showy. They talk about why are Latinos jockeys? And this is what Leggett says, not me. That American youngsters are bored with the menial tasks associated with the racetrack. And since the American diet is so much better than anything you can find in Latin America, they've simply literally outgrown the sport. So their argument is that Latin Americans are small because they're starving and they want to get the hell out of Latin America. Therefore, they come to the U.S. and they have, again, this is the implication, nothing to lose. So they get on the back of a 1,100-pound animal and try their luck. Right. Which led me, when I started reading Leggett's piece, to go, my God, I mean, this is a ridiculous depiction of Latinos. And so I went to the Puerto Rican jockey school, the Escuela Vocacional Hípica in Canóvanas, Puerto Rico, which is located in the racetrack Camarero, named for the horse in the world that holds the longest record of wins, was Puerto Rican.
Is that right?
Yes. And I went there for 6 weeks, and I got up at 5:30 every morning, and we did the barns, and we did all the training. I went to the classes in the afternoon. There's nothing more humbling than jockey school. Frankly, it makes PhD training look easy, and it's not. It's very, very grueling. It's very, very demanding. You are also mandated, if you don't have a high school diploma, to get one. So then you go to school 6 a.m. until 2 for horses, and from 2 until 7 to get your high school degree. It's not optional. So it's a very grueling experience. You're located at the main track. Everybody's watching you. And so I did a ton of interviews. Anyway, it was a big piece in the Blood Horse on what I'm going to tell you, which is Latin America isn't sending us poor, starving, small people. Being a jockey was a way of garnering honor. They come out of family dynasties in Latin America. The Corderos, the Pedrosas. I mean, these are huge families. And in fact, they're sending us their trained professionals. Because in the 1960s, jockey schools are established in Panama City, in Puerto Rico, in Mexico City, in Venezuela, that never existed in the United States. Never.
So this is a net benefit for America, right?
Correct.
But the way that Leggett wrote it,
and the way it was continued to write, is that Latinos are here to do the jobs Americans don't want to do, and they're small because they're starving, because Latin America is a terrible place.
So how long did that stereotype have currency for? When did it start to evaporate, or when people like you started to push back against it? Is it fairly recent, or...?
I still see echoes of it.
No. Well, that's not that surprising, right? Given how ingrained these things are.
I just taught a course on this at South Carolina, and it was super neat. The students were great, but the point is that what they do now is, for example, we just had a brilliant mare run. Her name is Letrusca. She's Mexican trained, born in Kentucky, Mexican trained, and she won in 21 the Eclipse Award, which is the highest award you can be awarded. Won so many Grade 1 races, did such a good job. Her trainer, Fausto Gutierrez, was a 10-time leading trainer at Las Americas racetrack in Mexico City. When he came here, nobody knew who the hell he was. Letrusca goes into the Apple Blossom race at Oakland Park, which is a huge race for fillies and mares. And she's in there with America's sweetheart, Monomoy Girl. Everybody loves I love Monomoy Girl. And a Swiss skydiver. It was a tough year of fillies and mares. And Letrusca was in there. And as she comes around the bend, I wish I could play it for you, and this is radio, so I really should have brought the clip. It's asinine, I didn't. But the announcer's voice breaks because he can't believe it. It cracks. And he goes, Letrusca is coming. He goes, it's the champion, 2 champions and the interloper. You're like, what? And so there's a way of constantly depicting any competitive Latin American horse who runs in the U.S. as
an interloper.
As brand new.
Right.
And so what I did with one of the chapters for the book that I'm writing for Kentucky Press called Setting the Record, Cañonero Segundo, Secretariat, and the History of Horse Racing in the Americas, is that I hammer out 65 pages of Latin American excellence in the United States and Latin America, but that historiography doesn't exist. I pieced it together at the National Racing Museum, at Saratoga, at Keeneland.
The only way to write against this is historical, right?
That's correct, because what they're essentially doing with these narratives is stripping the horses of a history of excellence.
Right. And you're restoring that.
Correct.
With your detailed research, you're putting them back where they belong. Right?
Well, I'm trying to show that if you're going to evaluate a Latin American horse, or a horse who began in Latin America, whether it was born in the U.S. and trained in Latin America or born in Latin America, look at the history of excellence.
Sure.
Look at Farda Amiga. Look at Invasor. Look at Candy Ride. I mean, come on now. And so what we did actually with my class, which was brilliant, this was a new initiative. I had them do what were called horse presentations. I'd never done it before. And they had to pick a Latin American born or trained horse. And they stood up and sort of gave highlights. But what they started doing was including clips from how the media portrayed them. And it was brilliant. And then what we did was assembled a timeline. And we started, I think the oldest horse I gave them was Cougar II, Chilean, and we ended with, I don't know, Letruska? I don't know. I can't remember. But we have at least 16 horses on there, and what I'd like to do now is digitalize that. So that when you look, they always, students tell me, for other classes, this class is so different. They go, for other classes, when I Google, because they Google, they go, I find too much, and I have to whittle it down. They go, I Google this, I find nothing. You need to look at sports as a very, very serious historical source. And you need to look at how broader processes in society influence how athletes are represented, especially at a time in the United States of racial integration. And we're writing Latino history into the South, doing so as well.
Good, because let's bring it down to something a bit more local.
Of course.
So South Carolina is home to, or in the 20th century, right?
Sure.
Camden, Charleston, and Aiken, is that right? Any more?
St. Matthews,
St. Matthews,
Ellery.
Ellery. Right? Ellery. These were fairly big places, right? I mean, well, put it this way, they were important meets, is that right?
It's not quite like that.
Okay.
What South Carolina was, it is home of training tracks. So South Carolina didn't have an oval. But because the climate was so good, because you had good horsemen, you know that Secretariat, Lucian Lauren, his trainer, had a home in Holly Hill.
I did not know that.
And Mr. Eddie Sweat, who was his groom, is from Vance.
Is that right?
So I'd love to see, by the way, South Carolina write itself into the Secretariat narrative.
Well, aren't you doing that?
I am doing that, but there are ways to do it, to put Holly Hill on the map, to put Vance on, because people come to see Mr. Sweat's grave all the time.
Is that right?
Yes.
Well, I never.
So what you've got in South Carolina are training tracks. What does that mean? It means when you buy a baby at the Ocala sale or the Keeneland sale or the Fasig-Tipton sale, wherever it is, they need to be what's called broken. And don't get alarmed. What it means is that you learn to have a saddle put on you, to be handled, to be groomed, to have your hooves picked, to ride on a track, to listen to a rider. Okay, it's the breaking grounds. And so people would buy horses, put them in a van, and ship them to Carolina.
Okay.
In Carolina, too, you would have champions such as Kelso. Kelso came out of Aiken. Palace Malice. And they would take breaks in South Carolina. Electrostatic, a good horse, just shipped out. He was on a break here. Eons, another good horse owned by Mr. Mark Greer.
How long does it take to break a horse?
The babies usually come in early fall. Depending on how their training goes, it will. They'll be shipping out about now.
Really?
Yes.
That's quite quick, really, isn't it?
It depends. Look, I hate to say it, but horse racing is tough, right? And the United States is one of the few countries that is hell-bent on racing 2-year-olds. So.
And other places don't do that?
No.
They wait till when?
3. So, because what you'll see is, if you spend time in a training track, is that knees are constantly being x-rayed to see if they're closing up, because you can't start a horse on a track, right? So it depends. I mean, anything can happen. And to tell you, the Kentucky Derby's coming up, and we'll talk about that. But the Kentucky Derby, again, is only 3-year-olds. Okay. You have one shot in your life. You have to qualify via a point system, winning or coming in second or third or fourth in qualifying races prior to that. It's a hard system. You have to work on a clockwork that is not kind to different kinds of development. So, but if you can make it, it's 20 horses, okay? Arguably the top 23-year-olds, and every horse turns over a year January 1st.
Okay.
Regardless if you were born in February or April.
Ooh, interesting.
South American horses turn it over in July or August. So so there's a differential there that's worth thinking about. But it's also hard to adapt to this system here. But anyway, to give you an example, if you can make it, if everything works, you don't spike a fever, you don't buck your shins, you don't hurt yourself in any way, and you can make it to the Derby, which is coming up, you have one shot in your life to do so. Yesterday, an excellent colt, Wild on Ice, was, so you can watch, everybody, if you want to watch on the YouTube, you put in morning workouts, Kentucky Derby, and you can watch all the horses, you get neat interviews. They do it for about 10 days before the Derby. And Wild on Ice was working out and he was pulled up with an injury, he was put down. So horse racing really embodies such an emotional high and low. To get a horse to that point and then have them suffer a catastrophic energy.
Brutal.
Absolutely. Everybody's shaken. And I'm so sorry for Wild on Ice and his connections.
You've done a lot of work at Aiken, correct?
I have.
Could you tell us something about what you've been up to there?
Aiken. So what I've been doing in Aiken is going out and watching the 2-year-olds train and meeting a lot of people in Aiken, learning the historical role of Aiken, and working with the wonderful museum coordinator, Lisa Hall, at the Aiken Racing Hall of Fame and Museum, which is located in Hopeland Gardens. And when I originally started working on this project, I thought I was going to work up at Kenny McPeak's farm in Kentucky. He said, yeah, come on up, do your project, no problem. But then someone told me Aiken, so I went out to Aiken, and Lisa Hall took me. She said, well, we have tours in March. And I said, no, this Friday. My kid's playing soccer. And she should have told me to shut up. But she didn't. She took me on a personal 3-hour tour of historic Aiken. The training track was founded in the early 1940s. They have historic barns. Like, to give you an idea, she does a barn tour that you should really go on. Some of those barns were taken apart and floated over from Europe on ships and then reassembled in Aiken.
What was the reason for that, by the way? That sounds a lot of effort.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Right.
People think of barns as messy. Nobody's messy at a thoroughbred training center. Absolutely not. It's the polar opposite. Okay,
there's like a laboratory, really. Right?
It's insane. So I didn't look anywhere else because I told Lisa what I wanted to do, and she's been so open, really. She and I have begun putting together an exhibit. She has a really neat exhibit on African American jockeys in the museum, and through interviews I've been doing in Spanish and English both, we're putting together an exhibit on Latino horsemen in Aiken. And right now it's on exhibit on this. It's a permanent exhibit.
Okay.
I got an American Council of Learned Societies fellowship for the year, and we're expanding that exhibit now with interviews that I've been doing in Aiken. And at first they were like, it's the lady who speaks Spanish and English standing on the rail all the time. Right. I mean, anyone can go out at 5, 6 a.m., take a coat. But it's really something else. There are different stables. It's a public training track.
Okay.
It's not owned by a certain trainer.
Is it owned by the state?
No, it's not owned by the state.
Okay.
But it is a public training track. At a certain point, one of the sheiks are big into racing, and one of them wanted to buy it and have it be a private training track.
Oh, really?
But they wanted to keep it public. So you see different sets come out, which are groups of horses training at a certain time. I've gotten to know a lot of individuals. I mean, people, I think in part, don't even realize. A lot of people look at the horse. They also look at the rider. They might know about the horse because they can look up his pedigree on Equibase but a lot of these riders, the Benitez in Aiken, their nephew just won the Eclipse Award for Best Apprentice Rider in the country, Jose Gomez. They go, he's my nephew, I remember when, neat family. Ramiro Tatas, who works for Carrie Fromer, is the assistant trainer for her barn. He worked at Arlington Park in Chicago for years. I mean, these people have been on the racetrack circuit. They have experiences in their own countries. Some of them came to the United States and worked in other things and got out of it and moved into horse racing. They preferred the work, they preferred the environment, and they identified more with it. If you think about it in a broad sense of the importance of the equine culture, in Mexico, one of the central images is of the charro, the cowboy. Equine culture is rooted in Latin American culture, not just Mexican. But one individual, I was asking him about Aiken, and he said that he'd been working in Florida and that they were vanning horses up. I don't know if they were, which is normal, headed to Maryland, headed to Saratoga, one of the racetracks. And that's a long trip for a horse. So the van stopped in Aiken, and they spent the night, let the horses out. And he said he saw Aiken at night and in the morning, and he said, I'm coming back. He said he wanted to make it home. So a lot of people, really, Latinos, are changing the face of Aiken whether it's through their role in horse racing or from horse racing they move into other things. But what people don't realize is some people that they would say, oh, he's a groom, he's an exercise rider. They reduce it to a labor question. And I don't mean to, what's the word in English when you, to place lesser value on those jobs, because their exercise rider and groom are crucial. They spend the most time with the horse. Right. But a lot of these guys also own thoroughbreds in their own right. So you can be both an employee and an owner training your own thoroughbred. Right. And people don't realize that. And I see it everywhere.
It's not like a Formula One car mechanic owning a car, right?
Bingo. And racing it himself, because understand that these meetings open at different times.
Right. So give me a sense of the economics of this, Gabi. I mean, it's a lot of money in horse racing, right? I mean,
That's
it's
correct.
a massive industry.
Yes.
Do you have a sense of its rated popularity? Is like American football probably is the most popular and what have you, and basketball. How popular is horse racing?
Okay, so in the 60s, 70s, 80s, I mean the golden age, it was number one.
Is that the golden age? Okay.
Number one.
Number one. How interesting.
Now it's lost traction absolutely to American football, to baseball, to basketball, without a doubt. Horse racing also needs to come up with some really new initiatives.
What would you recommend for that?
I've got a million ideas.
Give me one.
First of all, look, at some of these big races, people want to bring in Snoop Dogg, and they want to turn it into a club. So when the race is over, you can go clubbing at Gulfstream Park.
Okay.
Good and well, but look, that's not the audience who's coming back. There's a lot of places you can go clubbing.
Yeah.
One of the things that, and I did a set of interviews with a friend out in California. I think we were at Santa Anita, and we did more at Keeneland in Kentucky. And we went around and asked individuals, racing aficionados, right? We asked them, how did you get to the track? The stories were fantastic. And all the stories were the same. It was a relative. I don't care if it was your grandfather, your father, your uncle. One had a neighbor, your mother. But it was always family members. I took my students at Carolina to the Aiken Trials this year. We did a 10-hour field trip.
Wow.
They loved it. But they said we were so floored by the family dimension of horse racing. Look, if you want Pete to get the next generation at the track, have days where you have parent-child day. Have things like that. Promote the intergenerationality of these horse racing families, people who have gone and whose children might stray away from it. Many have. Really promote that. Don't put on Snoop Dogg. Have like empanadas. Have events. Have places where you can do things together. Take the kids on the golf carts to the backside so they can see the horses taking baths and doing things. You know, there's always stories within stories. Okay. Even at the Kentucky Derby, you know, a lot of people are pulling for Forte. Huge favorite. Great horse. Nothing to take away from Forte. Or Tap It Thrice. Great horse. But there's stories within stories. So there's a horse who's very, very good, named Mage. But Mage is lightly raced, but is done well. But the trainer and the jockey are both Venezuelan. Now, there was one Venezuelan trainer, rider, and Venezuelan trained horse who won the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness in 1971, Cañonero Segundo. So there's stories within stories, right? So everybody's sort of pulling for Mage, who understands the importance of Latin American racing. But look, of the jockeys named thus far, and we're still waiting for some of the names, I haven't made an official count. Well over half of them are Latino jockeys.
Is that right?
Yes.
This is for the upcoming Kentucky Derby?
Correct. Irado Ortiz, Javier Castellano, Luis Saez, you name it. They're all there. I heard Juan Hernandez is riding. That's wonderful.
Well, you basically just courted and invited what I was going to ask as my penultimate question for this chat.
Sorry.
If I were a betting person, which I'm not.
Yeah.
But if I were.
Yes. It would be okay if you were a betting person, Mark.
Well, I don't know about that. Well, perhaps. If I were to wager on the Kentucky Derby.
Yeah.
Given your expertise, given your knowledge, This is one way when historians actually can monetize their knowledge, right? Who would you back to win?
It's a good question. So what you want to do, and again, I'd like to say this about betting in South Carolina. South Carolina doesn't have a racetrack. The horses who are broken, if you will, trained, might be a kinder word, in Aiken, in Kingtree, Travis Durr, great training center, at Ellery with Mr. Gorey Smith, they all ship out to big racetracks.
Mm-hmm.
So in part, betting in South Carolina is a way of throwing your support behind a horse you might have watched train every morning, right? So it's a connection. It is the way, look, horse racing and breaking babies is part of South Carolina's identity, still.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in that point, you need to look at betting, especially betting when the money's already in the bank, not betting what you don't have.
Absolutely.
In important ways. Now, if you want to take an interesting little experience, pick up a program. They're very, very dense.
Mm-hmm.
They will give you all the horses' past performances, and they even they're limited to 3 adjectives at the end. Game, faded, accelerated. Yeah, not you, of course.
I feel like faded.
No, not you.
I'm certainly not game, and I'm certainly not accelerated, at least faded.
But they're very, very dense. They'll give you all kinds of statistics. They'll tell you who the horse lost to, if he lost or who he beat, the first 3.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a whole art to reading a program. As someone said, it really takes a historian to read a racing program well.
There you go. Applied history, right?
Applied history. And I also pull with the jockeys, different jockeys.
Yeah.
Where you've been riding, how you've been doing, because within each meeting, if you will, right now, Churchill Downs has Keeneland just closed, Churchill Downs just picked up. You have leading rider of each meeting.
Mm-hmm.
So you look at the competition within the competition. You also look at the experiences that have shaped different jockeys. Then you also, if you want to really get serious, watch the morning workouts. I thought Race Kane looked terrific this morning. Really terrific.
Okay.
And then you need to study, but you can't go off one day. That would be idiotic. You need to watch the workouts, and then you need to think about, maybe I could come up with an exacta, right? And maybe I'm gonna take Tap It Thrice or Forte or Angel of Empire, some of the big favorites, or Practical Move, but then who am I gonna pair it with?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you might be able to do something interesting. Having said that, the Derby consists of very young horses running in a 20-horse field. Anything can happen. Last year, Rich Strike went off 80-1 and drew into the Derby the morning of the race.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So anything can happen.
Yeah.
We have 2 Japanese horses who will be running.
Interesting.
Derma Sotogaki and Continuar. And the Japanese have been coming up and racing like crazy.
Yeah, I kind of like the name Tap It Thrice. I don't know why. Something about the word thrice. It just works.
It's very British.
They're very British.
It's very British. Nobody says thrice except for the British.
Yeah, I actually used it this morning.
Of course you did.
Oh, yes.
So you might put your money behind Tap It Thrice.
Tap It Thrice. Tell me about steeplechasing.
It's brilliant. It's terrifying.
It's awesome to watch. As in awe-inspiring. Those are very high, aren't they? Like when they go over and
it's insane. And there's a lot of thoroughbreds who raced on the track who prefer sort of, if you will, sort of the CrossFit exercise.
Yes.
If you don't mind not breathing the entire time, steeplechase is quite wild. The jockeys are different. Look, flat race jockeys will weigh in at 115. Steeplechase jockeys can weigh a little bit more.
Yeah.
But steeplechase is huge. They have the Stono Ferry down in Charleston. They have the one in Aiken. They have the one in Camden. They're on a national circuit.
Is it bigger than just straight racing, flat racing? What's the biggest one? Steeplechasing or?
You mean distance-wise?
No, just in terms of popularity.
Those are very different crowds. You get some crossover. I think they're both big.
Okay, interesting.
They're both big.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right, Gabi, last question,
Sure.
or last invitation to educate us further.
But I'm pulling for Mage.
Okay, well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to tap it thrice. As you're finishing up this book, it's going to be an important book.
Yeah.
And, we've been chatting about this over the years, and I'm just really delighted to see how this has formed and taken hold, and it's going to come to fruition. What would you like people, if you had to give them one takeaway from your book as you envision it, what would it be?
That Latin Americans who are staffing and participating at all levels in what is often referred to as America's oldest sport, if you leave out lacrosse and things like that,
Right.
is staffed with Latin America's best. They're trained professionals, and they have a long history in their own countries, within their own families, well before they come to the United States. Participating in horse racing, too, is remaking the image of the Latino in the United States. It is not solely about labor exploitation. It is not solely about doing the jobs America doesn't want to do. You should see them as trained professionals who are also making their own claims to honor, and I would argue engaging in acts of philanthropy for the well-being of the U.S. population with portions of their wins.
Gabi Kuenzli, thank you so much for a really interesting, fascinating, and enlightening conversation. Thanks for being on Take on the South.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark and Matt.
That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.